In celebration of the darker months, I thought I would tell a few stories that, although were chilling at the time, have inspired my work in more ways than I could ever imagine. This is one of those stories. Now, this story is one that actually happened, so it fits nicely under a writer's life. This is a story of the man who came to dinner, but was never invited. In Nigeria, I grew up in the city of Lagos. It was a sprawling, busy city that was sometimes more chaotic than it needed to be. Although based in the south of the country, bordering Yoruba land, the ancient homeland of the Yoruba people, it was a mix of all the tribes, as people flocked to the city to make money. Back then it was just rich and poor. There was no burgeoning middle class as there is now. When I say rich, I mean extremely wealthy. You had people who had property abroad and in the city, drove luxury cars, and helicopter trips to the airport were the norm. And on the other side were people sleeping on the streets and many suffering with mental health issues. They were also the majority, although we liked to think they weren't. The large disproportion in wealth seemed to go ignored as the city moved on in gaiety and desperation. We tried to deal with the encroaching poverty by building higher fences, taller gates, recruiting security guards, mobile police. I had family members who had their own armed guards, and mobile police were a very real thing, following certain family members around. We all had our own way of dealing with the inequality caused partly by decades of government incompetence and greed, which had eroded the city's universities and public education system. The money was now in top boarding schools and private institutions, which, as we all know, only the wealthy could afford. As the gap between rich and poor increased, the walls only grew taller and more reinforced. This was our way of keeping ourselves safe in an era of great uncertainty. However, one day those walls were breached, and we had an unexpected visitor. It was late evening in the family home in Nigeria, and it was just about dinner time. It was approximately 7 in the evening, and outside the crickets chirped in the warm night. Our home was arranged in an odd fashion, with a separate annex quite a distance away from the main house. It was separated by about 100 meters of lush garden, lots of trees, and huge bushes. That evening I'd chosen to hound my mother, who decided to have her dinner away from the family and in the annex. It was very dark outside, with a few lights dotted around the paths and walkways to guide our way to and fro. I'd gone into another room and was flipping through the pages of a book when I heard my mother's cutlery hit her plate. For some reason, the sound caught my attention. It was very resolute. There was a finality to it. The silence that followed was bone-chilling. How could it be my mother was sitting there perfectly still? I knew something was wrong. I sat in the other room waiting for her to move again, but everything was still, and I knew my mother well enough to know something or someone had caught her attention. I meekly emerged from the adjacent room and whispered to my mother, who came into view, "What is it?" But she didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the large glass sliding doors. She was looking to the outside, but it was all pitch black. I wondered what she saw that I didn't. And then, out of the darkness, I saw a slight movement. It wasn't a plant or an insect. It was very human. I realized it was a large human figure, partially melded to the shadows and darkness around it. We both remained transfixed. My mother not saying anything at all. Someone was standing outside and watching us. It was then I realized the sliding door had not been locked. "Mummy," I whispered, "what should we do?" As if to show us what we were up against, the figure in the shadow stepped out into the light. The man was tall and looked pretty strong. He simply stood there, staring at us as we gawped at the silhouette in shock. We were trapped. No one would have plans to come to the annex anytime soon. The rest of the family were enjoying their dinner across the garden, and the security guards did their lap every 20 minutes, and a lot could have happened by then. My mom did not respond to me for the first time in a long time. It was as though she had nothing to say. She just stood there, watching him. Together we watched the silhouette. His hair formed into a huge afro, with the ends of it matted into coils. At the time, I was fascinated by the idea of locked hair. "Don't worry, he wouldn't try to come in," my mother said. I was perplexed as to how she knew that. How did she know he wasn't some dangerous person, intent on causing havoc? By the time the rest of the neighborhood were aware of our screams, it would be too late. We watched each other for a while. My heart thundered at first, but then gradually returned to a normal state. The more he stood there watching, the more it dawned on me that my mother was right. He meant us no harm. Back then, we had practically no mental health resources, and mental health and homelessness was something reserved for the poor. Much of society didn't seem to understand it, nor seek to. We tried to separate ourselves from it all, as we pushed the responsibility further down the ranks. The stigma of it all fell with them, not us. The visitor observed us for a while longer. Then, as if he was done communicating, he melted back into the darkness, stepping off the path into the bushes. We weren't sure if he was still present. Was it a ruse to get us to emerge? However, moments later, the dogs in the next house started barking, a sure sign he was on the move. The barking led our own dogs to emerge from the other end of the garden, barking in response. The stranger was gone. I'd like to say it was an adventure of some sort, or some chilling moment in my history, but rather, it was more of a lesson. Couldn't ignore the problem, no matter how many security gates and fences we put up. The walls and boundaries would not keep the problems away. Those problems were still out there, and would still be out there. You could ignore them, but eventually they would come knocking. And they would not be as chivalrous as this gentleman was. In a few of my books, I have moments where intrusions come, unexpected and uninvited to my characters. When I write those scenes, it's always to invoke a feeling of disquiet. It's never an all-out fear. It's never violent or raucous. It's always quiet and chilling and deadly as it grows into all-out terror. There's something my mother said that night that still sticks with me. He chose to be nice to us. He made a choice. We did not. The choice was never ours to make. And back then I never understood what she meant by that statement. But now I realize that with every human lies that choice. Some would consider the events terrifying, but for me it was a good introduction to character arcs and the possible paths characters could take over the course of books. I hope you enjoyed it.